Hello, and welcome to the Advocacy with Anachie Podcast. I am so happy to be your host. My name is Anachie. I'm a senior at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I will be graduating with a Bachelor of Music. And I use she, her pronouns. And I wanted to start this podcast because I am a musician with low vision. I'm a disabled woman, and I feel as though we don't talk about disability enough, especially in its conjunction with music. And so I decided, with the help of Dr. Kirsten Johnson, my advisor for my senior project, to compile this podcast, to just talk about this and have a dialogue, and with myself and also with my viewers, for anybody that stumbles along this podcast. And so I, as a musician, starting super young, playing in orchestra and singing in choir, and not being able to see was a huge struggle for me. And it really set me back from being included in music. And especially in the instrumental world. Not being able to see a score is detrimental to being a successful instrumentalist. And so as I've experienced growing up in the music world, I feel as though we have made some improvements. But I think talking about it is super important, and talking about our experiences and talking about others' experiences, especially in a historical perspective, is very valuable. And so this podcast, the premise of this podcast, is to explain the conjunction between disability studies and music. And so I want to touch on advocacy and how that is what connects music and disability studies. And so this is my first installment of the podcast. I hope to continue this beyond my education, since this is my senior kind of capstone project. But in this podcast, I hope to break down what disability studies is and how its history is brief. Although disabled musicians have been making music work for themselves for a very long time. The actual term of disability studies and defining it is relatively recent. And so, although the disabled community has been present a very long time, it's interesting that disability studies hasn't been ventured sooner, and I'll talk about that later. And so this podcast, my goal is to make this topic approachable to everyone, and to have this kind of vibe that is not, it doesn't need to be 100% academic to be effective. And so this is casual. I'm gonna make mistakes. It's a podcast. It's supposed to be a dialogue, a conversation between me and you. Whoever is watching this, hopefully someone who is interested on the topic, or if you're not even interested on this topic and you just stumbled upon this podcast, I want to thank you for being here. So that is the premise of this podcast. I am super excited to have you here, and thank you for watching. Okay, so my first point of this installment is explaining what disability studies is. And so I have Girly here with me. Remember, I said this is casual podcast. Anyway, so here I am to explain what disability studies is to whoever wants to hear my definition, and built off of scholarly definitions. And so I have here from the first paragraph of the Oxford Handbook of Music and Disability Studies, which is an immense and insanely good resource for those interested in this topic, music and disability studies. And so here's the first paragraph, because I feel like it's very pertinent to this situation. In recent years, disability has emerged as a category of cultural analysis in the humanities, tracking the earlier trajectories of gender, sexuality, and race and ethnicity. Emerging with the disabilities rights movement in the late 1980s, which led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The new interdisciplinary field of disability studies has offered a socio-political analysis of disability, focusing on its social construction and shifting attention from biology to culture. The medical sciences consider disability a deficit with respect to normal standards of good health and seek diagnosis and cure. In contrast, disability studies explores the social, cultural, and political meanings of disability with the goal of understanding human variety and difference. At the core of this field is the contention that, although it may have a concrete somatic basis, disability is endowed with meaning by elaborate interpretive networks that emerge within particular societies whose purpose is to make sense of the diversity of human morphology, capability, and behavior. While we may relegate the study of biological impairments to the medical establishment, this cultural study of disability has been energetically undertaken by humanists from a variety of disciplines. So yes, that was a big quote, but it really encapsulates what I'm trying to get at here. Disability is not just a medical thing. Disability is a social thing. We are marginalized, and we need to be included in intersectionality. And so this is interesting to think about because disability advocacy is actually a relatively new thing, unfortunately. ADA wasn't ratified until 1990, and so the disabled rights movement didn't really take off until 1980. And so this is significant. This is significant because disability has existed since the beginning of humankind. There's no evidence that proves that everyone has been completely abled. And so this is significant that this kind of movement hasn't really started until 1980, which, when you think about it, is only like 40 years ago. And when you think about like the scope of the world, that's insane. It's disappointing, but it's also hopeful because we're looking towards a better future, and advocating and tired and advocating for this topic, this intersection of human rights is so important and relevant no matter how many years we've been working at it. And so cultural disability studies is actually an emerging field, which I think is really cool, and I'm glad that it's a thing, and it's growing. It's growing by the day, which is amazing. And so I have a couple comments about that quote. As a disabled woman, I feel as though using the words deficit or ailment towards those who have a disability is a negative thing. And so it's kind of hard to look at texts on the topic especially because I have experience, firsthand experience as a woman with a disability. And so I think that we should try not to talk about what we can't do and talk about what we can, because really being disabled doesn't mean you're unabled. It means you have to do things differently. And so I just kind of want to throw that tidbit in there about how verbiage and language is super important. And I think my generation has kind of really put emphasis on that. So I think we should focus on that and make sure that that's a thing that is important, especially when we're referring to marginalized groups. So yeah. And then now I wanted to kind of tie in another one of my sources, Lerner Sounding Off, Theorizing Disability in Music. That book is also super great resource for the topic of the conjunction of disability studies and music. So here is the quote. The intellectual work of cultural disability studies is to show that the concept of disability saturates the cultural fabric. This new scholarly enterprise of tracing disability's threads can illuminate how we think about ourselves and one another and how we structure the world we share together. The exemplary academic analysis that makes up this book demonstrates how we are actually cultured to think of disability as a medical condition or a personal misfortune. And this is actually one of the facts that is informing principles of musical artist production. What is fresh here is the explanation of how the concept of disability shapes music, and music shapes the concept of disability. So that's super powerful, because disability is part of the cultural fabric, just like sexuality, gender, and race is part of the cultural fabric of the world and music specifically. And so I think that's one of the most beautiful things about music, is how it's about the human experience, and disability is a human experience. And so when I saw this quote and I realized that disability actually shapes music in the same way that music shapes disability, I thought that was really cool, and I wanted to bring that up. So this quote basically just begins to formulate the conjunction of disability studies and music, for they shape each other inversely and directly. Cool. Another quote from the book. Disability shows us and is an inherent and enduring aspect of human variation that shapes human aesthetic and cultural productions. So, aesthetics of music and culture are directly related to the human experience, and the variations within that include disability and other marginalized groups, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. Aesthetics is everything when it comes to art, and I'm speaking from experience, because that is the goal of art. It's to reach a certain aesthetic. It's to display a certain experience, to convey a certain message, to pull out feelings. And so next up, I would like to talk about a little historical perspective on the conjunction between disability studies and music. So, like I mentioned earlier, disability studies field is actually a relatively new thing. Just like most studies of marginalized groups, unfortunately, like race, gender, and sexuality studies. And so I kind of wanted to unpack the significance of this and ask the question, why has it taken so long? Why? I think it's great that we're starting to really, really ground these studies. But I think it all has to do with privilege and who's writing the history. And so I just wanted to open that question up in this podcast. But this is the important part. However, there is evidence that those with disabilities have been making music throughout history, although they may have not been quartered with the term disability yet. So we have Francesco Il Sico, I practiced that, but I didn't get it. Beethoven, Antonio Zaccara, Thomas Wiggin, and many more. And I kind of wanted to touch on here how those were all men, and we have records of that, but as a result of females not being included in the musicking process in the pre-modern and classical eras, they're definitely kept on the down low, so we don't have as much examples of that. And so this is another question I wanted to bring up. How can we uncover the female disabled perspective of the past? How can we rewrite history books to include disabled narrative? And I think this is super duper important because we're looking for representation of all of these intersectionality studies, and how we can change curriculum and music studies to include these things. Because growing up and taking music classes, I never, ever, ever heard of any of these disabled musicians that I studied over the course of this semester before. And I think that's not okay. That's complicit curriculum. And so I just wanted to open up that question. How can we uncover that and include that in the narrative? Because I think we need to do that. And then next up, I just wanted to talk about some examples of advocacy within the arts and music. And so this is all about making music work for the disabled. So, first example I got. I wanted to kind of mention the emergence of one-handed piano pieces. So I have a quote here from Vargas' book, Disabled in Music Performance, and it kind of shows how composers actually adapt to musicians' abilities. That book is another great resource. So, let me get the quote up. Okay. Here we go. One-handed pianism. Rehabilitation. One-handed pianism exemplifies the perception of impairments as something that could be restored. That is, in the context of one-handed performance, disability is understood as the lack of two-handed functionality and the need to restore the performing capabilities of one-handed pianists. So this kind of chapter in this book explores performing capabilities and how composers adapted their music to make it accessible for those who only had one functioning hand. And so we have an example of this, the virtuosic pianist Adolfo Fumagalli. Wow, I'm butchering these names. Fumagalli, who lived from 1828 to 1856, who wrote lots of left-handed music for the piano. And this is actually a great example of inclusive composition style because it's adapting the music for the musicians and their capabilities and their abilities. Okay, next up I wanted to touch on Beethoven, one of the most prolific composers of all time, who suffered from hearing loss. And I kind of want to talk about how his hearing loss affected his compositions. And so I have this quote. In his early works, when Beethoven could hear the full range of frequencies, he made use of higher notes in his compositions. But as his hearing failed, he began to use the lower notes that he could hear more clearly. And this is his way of continuing his craft. And so, not only do composers adapt their writing for those who are going to perform their music, they also adapt their music for how they function in this space. And so Beethoven, moving his pitches lower to lower frequencies so he could feel and hear them better, is just a way of him advocating for himself and continuing the art form that he was so prolific in, despite losing his hearing. Then I wanted to talk about the queen, I think one of the queens of disability studies in music, Evelyn Glennie, who has been deaf since the age of 12. And she actually started to lose her hearing at the age of 8, which is very interesting and pertinent to me, because that's when I started to lose my vision. And so I know how the trauma of that age kind of my dog is freaking out, adds to your artistry, experiencing that loss. But not being able to hear doesn't inhibit her ability to perform. She regularly plays barefoot during live performances and studio recordings to feel the music better, and she's been published on her discussion of how music is in conjunction with disability studies many times, and it's very, very cool to watch her perform because she makes music work for her even though she can't hear. I think that's just beautiful. So finally, I want to just conclude this first installment of the Advocacy with Anachie podcast and touch back on why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because I want to see a change, and I want to see disability studies and music come together more, especially in the curriculum, along with other marginalized groups, because I think it's very important to be included in the narrative. Because me not feeling like I could participate in music when I was younger still affects me today, and I think we need to continue this dialogue and discourse on the topic. And I want to thank you for listening to me, and please leave a comment, share this video, and have a lovely day and discuss change. Thank you.